What if almost everything you were taught about Black American ancestry was incomplete? Not wrong, incomplete. Because for the first time, scientists didn't ask historians. They asked DNA, and DNA does not care about the stories we tell ourselves. It only records what actually happened. Generation after generation, coastline after coastline, one broken family tree at a time. For most of American history, there was one word used to describe millions of different people: Black, African American. A single label stretched over an entire population, as if everyone who wore it shared the same blood, the same journey, the same map back to the same shore. It was simple. It was convenient. And according to the genome, it was never actually true. When geneticists finally sat down and sequenced the DNA of hundreds of African Americans side by side with people from West Africa and people from Europe, they were not expecting a tidy answer. They got the opposite. They got chaos, in the best possible sense. A portrait of a population so genetically varied that the label African American stopped looking like a bloodline and started looking like a history, worn differently by every single person who carries it. Here is the number that broke the illusion first. In one of the largest genome-wide studies ever conducted on this population, led by researchers from the University of Pennsylvania and Cornell, scientists analyzed the DNA of over 300 African Americans alongside West Africans from a dozen countries and Europeans from more than 40. What they found was almost impossible to summarize with an average, because the range was the story. Some individuals who identified as African American carried DNA that was 99% West African. Others, carrying the exact same label, the exact same identity, the exact same word on a birth certificate, showed as little as 1% West African ancestry. Same community, same history in the broad sense, completely different genetic inheritance. Sit with that for a second. Two people, both raised Black in America, both descended, in some sense, from the same historical rupture, the transatlantic slave trade, the plantations, the centuries that followed. And yet, one of them is genetically almost entirely West African, while the other is genetically almost entirely something else. That is not a footnote. That is a complete rewriting of what ancestry even means for a population that was, for centuries, treated as if it were genetically uniform. On average, across the study, the West African component came out to somewhere around 77%. That is the headline number people repeat. But averages hide individuals, and individuals are where the real story lives. Because behind that 77% average is a staggering spread. Families where the African inheritance is nearly total, and families where it has been diluted almost to the point of disappearing, all sitting under the same cultural and historical identity. So where did the rest of that DNA come from? This is where the science stops being abstract and starts being uncomfortable, because it is not a mystery, it is documented, and it is brutal. Across multiple independent studies, researchers have consistently found that the average African American genome carries somewhere close to a quarter European ancestry. Not a rounding error, not a rare exception. A quarter on average, embedded into the genetic code of an entire population. And when scientists asked why, the answer was not migration, not choice, not intermarriage in any voluntary sense. The predominant explanation researchers point to is sexual violence. Coercion carried out by white enslavers, slave traders, and their associates against enslaved women generation after generation for as long as slavery existed on this continent. That is not speculation. That is the leading scientific explanation for why so much European DNA sits inside African American genomes today. The numbers are not a story about blending cultures. They are a forensic record of power, ownership, and abuse, preserved in the one place that cannot be edited after the fact, the double helix itself. One researcher who dug specifically into paternal lines found something almost unbelievable in scale. Looking at the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, researchers estimated that roughly 35% of all African American men descend from a white male ancestor who fathered a child during the era of slavery. And in the overwhelming majority of those cases, that conception was the product of rape or coercion, not consent. 35%. More than 1 in 3 African American men, carrying a direct paternal line back to a white man who almost certainly forced himself onto an enslaved woman. That is not ancient history sitting quietly in a textbook. That is present tense biology. That is a chromosome sitting inside a living man today, carrying the fingerprint of an assault that happened 200 years ago. And this is where the genetics start to reveal something even more specific than percentages. They reveal direction. Scientists studying the X chromosome, which carries a slightly different inheritance pattern than the rest of the genome, found elevated levels of African ancestry concentrated there. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, because the X chromosome inheritance pattern is a signature. It points toward a very specific historical pattern of mating. one in which African ancestry entered predominantly through mothers, while European ancestry entered predominantly through fathers. In other words, the DNA itself preserves the shape of the abuse. It is not just recording that mixing happened. It is recording who had power over whom and in which direction that power moved. Genetics, in this case, functions almost like a court record that was never allowed to be filed anywhere else. Now, stretch this out across the map of the United States, and the story gets even more textured, because ancestry is not evenly distributed. It clusters. It pools in certain places for very specific historical reasons, and once you know those reasons, the genetic data stops looking random and starts looking like a documentary. Take Louisiana. For generations, Louisiana functioned as a crossroads, a trading hub where enslaved Africans, European colonists, and indigenous peoples were all funneled through the same ports, the same markets, the same overlapping communities. Genetic researchers studying ancestry across the country found that Louisiana shows some of the most complex, most heavily mixed ancestry profiles of any state, a direct genetic echo of its unique position as a meeting point of populations that almost nowhere else in the country mingled quite so intensely. Then look at Oklahoma, and the pattern shifts to a completely different historical wound. Researchers found that Oklahoma has the highest concentration of African Americans carrying significant Native American ancestry anywhere in the country. That is not a coincidence, and it is not ancient mystery either. It traces directly back to the Trail of Tears, when the federal government forcibly relocated Native nations to what is now Oklahoma. Many of those Native nations, tragically, also held enslaved black people at the time, and the result, generations later, is a population whose DNA still carries the fingerprints of two separate forced migrations layered on top of each other, in the same place, in the same families. And then there is the coast, specifically the Sea Islands off South Carolina and Georgia, home to the Gullah people. If you want to know what African American ancestry looked like before centuries of admixture reshaped it, the Gullah communities are as close to that answer as modern genetics can get. Researchers consistently find that Gullah populations carry the highest concentration of West African ancestry of any African American group in the country. Their relative geographic isolation on barrier islands, cut off from the mainland for generations, meant that the genetic dilution happening almost everywhere else in the country happened here far more slowly. In a very real sense, the Gullah genome is the closest living genetic snapshot we have of what was carried across the ocean during the transatlantic slave trade, preserved almost by accident, through isolation rather than intention. So when you put the map together, Louisiana's mixing, Oklahoma's Trail of Tears overlap, the Gullah Islands isolation, you start to see that African American ancestry was never a single river flowing from one point to another. It was more like a delta, splitting into dozens of separate channels the moment it hit American soil, each one shaped by a different regional history, a different set of forced encounters, a different set of survivors making it through to the next generation. Now here's where the science gets even more uncomfortable, because it does not stop at ancestry percentages. It follows those percentages into the body. For decades, medicine in the United States operated on the assumption that race was a reliable stand-in for biology, that if a patient checked the box marked black, doctors could reasonably guess certain things about their genetic risk factors, their likely response to medication, their disease predisposition. The genome says that assumption was flawed from the start. One of the largest studies ever conducted on this question, run through the National Institutes of Health using genetic data from more than 200,000 participants, found that self-reported race and ethnicity map extremely poorly onto actual genetic ancestry. People who checked the same box on a form carried wildly different ancestry profiles underneath. And the researchers found something even sharper than that. Different African ancestries carried different biological associations entirely. West Central African ancestry, specifically, was linked to higher body mass index, while East African ancestry was linked to lower body mass index. Two ancestries that a simple racial checkbox would have lumped together as identical, despite carrying measurably different biological signatures. Think about what that means for something as basic as a hospital intake form. An entire medical system built partly on the assumption that black is a biologically meaningful category, when the genome is telling us, in study after study, that the category is far too blunt an instrument to carry that kind of weight. The original researchers who first mapped the range of West African ancestry across the population warned about exactly this danger, cautioning that prescribing treatment based on broad racial guidelines could be genuinely risky, precisely because the underlying ancestry, hiding beneath the label African American, varies so enormously from one person to the next. This is not a small correction to a footnote in a textbook. This is a fundamental challenge to how an entire country has organized its thinking about race, medicine, and identity for over a century. The genome is not saying race does not matter as a lived, social, historical experience. It clearly does, and nothing I, And this data erases the reality of what that experience has meant for millions of people. What the genome is saying is something more precise. That race, as a biological category, was always a rough guess dressed up as certainty, and that guess starts to fall apart the moment you actually look inside the cell. So if percentages and averages only get you so far, what does get you closer to the truth? This is where a newer approach in genetic research tries to go beyond simply saying someone is a certain percent African or a certain percent European. Researchers from Stanford and the University of Southern California developed a method that attempts something more ambitious, not just estimating a percentage, but estimating an actual number of ancestors. Applying this method to African American genealogy, stretching back to the 1600s, the researchers tried to approximate how many individual African ancestors and how many individual European ancestors sit somewhere in a single person's family tree, going back nearly 4 centuries. Why does that distinction matter so much? Because a percentage flattens everything into a single ratio, but a family tree is made of actual people, actual individuals who were born, who survived or did not survive, who were separated from families, who were sold, who were forced into unions they never chose, who nonetheless produced descendants who are alive today, reading or hearing this exact sentence. Turning a percentage back into a head count of ancestors is, in a strange way, an attempt to give back some of the humanity that raw statistics tend to strip away. It is one thing to say a person is 77% West African. It is another thing entirely to say that somewhere in that person's family tree are dozens or hundreds of specific human beings, each with their own unrecorded name, each one a link in an unbroken chain that somehow survived the worst that American history had to offer. And that survival is really the part of this story that gets lost when people focus only on the raw numbers. Because underneath every statistic in this entire body of research is the same quiet fact. Someone made it through. Every single strand of DNA being studied in these labs exists because an ancestor, at some point, under conditions almost impossible to imagine, survived long enough to have a child, who survived long enough to have a child, who survived long enough to have a child, all the way down to the person alive right now whose cheek swab ended up in a university lab. The forced migrations, the sexual violence, the disease, the brutal labor, the deliberate separation of families sold off to different plantations, all of it was designed, in the most literal historical sense, to break lineages apart. And yet, here's a population whose genome, when finally read carefully, tells a story of continuity that outlasted every attempt to sever it. There is something almost defiant in that fact. The DNA does not just record trauma, it also records persistence. Every single one of those genetic markers, from the West African 77% average to the European quarter mixed in through violence, to the small pockets of Native American ancestry concentrated in places like Oklahoma, represents a line that refused to end. Historians could only ever piece together fragments of this story from ship manifests, from plantation ledgers, from the scattered surviving paperwork of an institution that often didn't bother recording enslaved people's names at all. Genetics does something those documents never could. It reaches directly into the body and pulls out a record that nobody with power over these families ever intended to leave behind. That is really the deeper meaning behind everything this research has uncovered. It is not just a scientific curiosity about percentages and chromosomes. It is a correction to a historical record that was, quite deliberately, left incomplete. Slavery's paperwork was designed to erase identity, to strip enslaved people of names, of family ties, of any documented connection to where they came from or who came before them. For a very long time, that erasure worked. Generations of African Americans grew up with genealogical trails that simply stopped, hitting a wall somewhere in the 1800s, where the written record went silent because the people who kept those records did not consider enslaved lives worth writing down in any real detail. DNA does not care about that silence. It was never part of that system of erasure, because it does not live in a courthouse ledger or a plantation account book. It lives inside the body, passed directly from parent to child, regardless of what anyone chose to write down. And so, more than a century after the end of slavery, and more than half a century after the civil rights movement forced the country to at least legally reckon with its past, science has found a backdoor into a history that was supposed to be permanently locked. Millions of African Americans, using nothing more than a cheek swab and a home testing kit, are now able to recover fragments of a story that the written record insisted did not exist. Of course, none of this means the science hands anyone a complete, tidy family tree with names attached. It usually cannot do that. What it can do is point toward regions, toward specific countries, specific ethnic groups in West Africa, specific patterns that match historical trade routes, and specific ports where enslaved people were most often taken from. Nigeria, Cameroon, the Congo, Mali, Senegal, Benin, Togo, Ivory Coast, Ghana. These are not random names pulled from a map. They are, overwhelmingly, the same regions where the transatlantic slave trade concentrated its worst activity. And it is not a coincidence that they are also the regions showing up again and again inside the ancestry results of African Americans testing their DNA today. The genome is, in effect, redrawing the shipping routes of an atrocity, one household at a time. And this is where the story becomes personal in a way that raw historical narrative rarely manages to achieve. A history book can tell you, in general terms, that millions of people were taken from West Africa and brought to the Americas. It is true, and it is important, but it can also feel distant, abstract, almost too large to actually absorb. A DNA test does something different. It takes that same enormous historical event and folds it down into a single, specific, individual answer. This region, this ethnic group, this coastline, connects to you, specifically, sitting right here, right now. That kind of specificity changes how people relate to their own history. It is the difference between reading that a hurricane once hit a coastline and being told that the very ground you're standing on was under that exact storm. None of this erases the pain embedded in the story, and it was never meant to. If anything, the genetic data makes the pain more precise, not less. It is one thing to know abstractly that slavery involved sexual violence. It is another thing to look at a genetic report and understand that the European ancestry sitting inside your own genome, inside your own children, is very likely a direct biological consequence of that specific violence, carried out against a specific ancestor, whose name is almost certainly lost forever. That is a heavy thing to sit with. But there is also something clarifying about it, because vague historical guilt or vague historical shame tends to get diffused into abstraction over enough generations. A genetic marker does not allow that diffusion. It sits there, specific and undeniable, refusing to let the history soften into myth. At the same time, this same body of research keeps us circling back to a genuinely hopeful thread, one that is easy to miss if you only focus on the darker parts of the story. The sheer diversity uncovered inside African American DNA that spread from 1% to 99% West African ancestry inside a single population is also, in its own way, evidence of resilience on a massive scale. It shows a population that absorbed the worst that forced migration, sexual violence, and centuries of legal discrimination could throw at it, and did not just survive as a population, but kept reproducing, adapting, and forming new family structures across an enormously varied set of circumstances, from Louisiana's port cities to Oklahoma's forced relocations to the isolated shores of the Gullah Islands. Every single one of those different genetic profiles represents a different specific survival story, and together they add up to something much larger than any single narrative could capture. It is also worth pausing on how recently all of this has become knowable at all. For most of American history, this level of genetic detail simply did not exist. Families passed down oral histories, fragments of names, half-remembered locations, and had almost no way to verify any of it against anything concrete. The technology that allows a person today to send off a small vial of saliva and receive back a detailed breakdown of West African regional ancestry, European ancestry, and even Native American ancestry has really only existed in a widely accessible form for the last 15 to 20 years. That means an entire population spent centuries with deliberately severed historical records, and only very recently gained access to a tool that can partially reconnect what was cut, and the tool keeps getting sharper. Early ancestry studies could really only offer broad continental categories: African, European, or Native American, full stop. Newer research, like the massive NIH-led analysis of over 200,000 genomes, is now capable of distinguishing between much finer regional categories within those continents, separating West Central African ancestry from East African ancestry, for example, and showing that even those finer categories carry distinct biological signatures. Genealogical methods are advancing too, moving from simple percentage estimates toward actual counts of likely ancestors stretching back centuries. Every year, the resolution of this picture gets a little sharper, a little more specific, a little closer to answering questions that used to be permanently unanswerable. There's also a quieter revolution happening inside the world of forensic and historical archaeology that runs parallel to all of this, and it deserves a moment of attention, because it shows how genetic evidence is starting to reach backward in time, even further than a living person's cheek swab can reach. Researchers studying burial sites connected to the transatlantic slave trade, cemeteries, unmarked graves, sites, uncovered during construction projects in cities up and down the East Coast, have begun extracting DNA directly from centuries-old skeletal remains and comparing that ancient genetic material against modern reference populations in West Africa. In several cases, scientists have been able to trace specific individuals buried in American soil back to specific ethnic and linguistic groups on the African continent. sometimes with enough precision to identify a probable homeland region centuries after that person's name, story, and identity had been completely lost to written history. When those findings are shared with descendant communities, they do something that a simple percentage breakdown cannot fully replicate. They put a physical, buried, once-living person back into the timeline, closing a gap that many families assumed could never be closed. This kind of work is slow, expensive, and still relatively rare, but it is growing, and it points toward a future where genetic ancestry research stops being limited to living participants and starts actively excavating the historical record itself, quite literally from the ground up. Each new burial site analyzed adds another data point, another confirmed route, another piece of evidence about exactly which coastal regions, which kingdoms, and which communities were most heavily targeted by traders operating in different decades and different ports. Slowly, the map of the transatlantic slave trade is being redrawn, not from shipping manifests written by traders who had every incentive to obscure what they were doing, but from the actual biological remains of the people who were taken. It is worth remembering, too, that none of this research exists in a vacuum, separate from the people it describes. Every study cited in this story, every percentage, every regional breakdown, represents real families opting in, submitting their own DNA, agreeing to have their genetic material compared against reference populations, often specifically, because they wanted answers that the written historical record had permanently withheld from them. Scientists did not simply extract this information from a distance, they built it in partnership with a population that had spent generations being denied access to its own history, and many of the researchers involved, including geneticists of African descent working at the center of these major studies, have spoken about the personal weight of finally being able to offer concrete answers to questions their own families had been asking for decades. That collaborative dimension matters, because it shapes how this information gets used going forward. Ancestry results are increasingly showing up not just in personal curiosity searches, but in college courses, in museum exhibits, and community genealogy workshops specifically organized to help African American families trace regional origins that census records and slave ledgers deliberately obscured. Entire family reunions have been reorganized around a DNA result that pointed toward a specific country or ethnic group, prompting descendants to travel to that region for the first time, sometimes meeting distant genetic relatives who had no previous knowledge that a branch of their family had been taken across the ocean centuries earlier. What started as an academic genetics paper in a journal most people will never read has, in many documented cases, ended in an actual reunion between two branches of a family, separated by an ocean and by hundreds of years, which raises an interesting question about where all of this goes next. If the science has already shown that ancestry within a single population can range from nearly zero to nearly total on a supposedly shared identity marker, and if it has already shown that broad racial categories fail to predict real biological differences with any precision, then the entire framework the country has used to talk about race for the last few centuries is standing on genuinely shaky ground. Not because race does not matter socially, historically, and personally. Clearly it does, and clearly it always will, because lived experience is not erased by a genetic report. But biologically, the neat little boxes are dissolving under the weight of the data itself, replaced by something messier, more individual, and honestly, far more interesting than the story anyone was originally told. So where does that leave the average person looking at their own DNA results today? Probably somewhere between grief and pride, holding both at once, because that is really what this entire body of research keeps handing back to people. Grief, because the specific mechanisms behind so much of this ancestry were violent, coercive, and deliberately hidden from the historical record for generations. And pride, because despite every single attempt to erase identity, sever family lines, and prevent any coherent history from surviving, the story made it through anyway, written into the one archive that no plantation ledger, no legal system, and no act of deliberate erasure was ever able to touch. That archive is sitting inside every living cell of every African American alive today. And for the first time in history, science has finally learned how to read it. And maybe that is the real headline buried underneath all of these studies, all of these percentages, all of these regional maps and chromosome patterns. Not that Black American ancestry turned out to be complicated, though it did. Not that the history behind it turned out to be darker than most people were taught in school, though it was. The real headline is that a story deliberately erased by force, by law, and by silence has been recovered anyway, cell by cell, generation by generation, through a science that did not even exist when that erasure began. The people who tried to sever these lineages are long gone. The lineages, remarkably, are not.